Hi, my name is Lawrence Gehrig, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Lawrence.
And my sobriety date is March the 6th of 2019. Thanks so much to Hayward and to Steve for inviting me to speak tonight, and thanks to my friends Josh and Audrey who rode up with me tonight. I am a member of the Came to Believe group in Rocky Mount, and we are a three-legacy group. We meet at St. Paul United Methodist Church at the corner of Bethlehem Road and I can't remember the name of the other street right now. Westmount Drive, Bethlehem Road and Westmount Drive. We meet there on Tuesdays and Fridays at 7 o'clock. And on Tuesdays, we're a big book study group. We go all the way through the big book, including the stories. We just started the whole book over again. We do that on the first 3 Tuesdays of each month. On the 4th Tuesday, we study the tradition corresponding with the month. When there's a 5th Tuesday, we have a history meeting. On Fridays, we have a topic meeting. The topic is chosen by the chair for the meeting from AA-approved literature. And on the last Friday of each month, we have a speaker meeting, just one speaker meeting a month. And that's our only open meeting each month. So that's the group I'm in. I do have a sponsor, and I've talked with him today and met with him last Friday. And he's not able to be here tonight. I have someone I sponsor. I have a grand sponsor who's here tonight, and that's great. I love the way we have these sponsorship families in AA. And whenever I've attended speaker meetings, I always hear people say they're going to tell how they were, what happened, and how they are now. And I will generally do that. But my sponsor also asked me to be aware of the paragraph on page 29, where it says each individual in the personal stories describes in his own language and from his own point of view the way he established his relationship with God. And I like to talk about that whenever I have the opportunity to share, because I think it's important to just point out right from the beginning that I've spent my entire life in the church and my entire adult life working in the church. As a church musician, I've been at the same church for the past 32 years. And so I felt like I had a relationship with God, and I did have a relationship with God, but the more I drank, the more distant that relationship became. And the less and less I prayed, the more I drank. And ultimately, it was something as simple as prayer that was the solution to the problem, which I discovered in AA after being in AA for quite a while. So I will now go back and tell you a little bit of my history and my growing up and so on and so forth, and my drinking and what happened and how things are today. So I was born in Wilson, North Carolina, and we moved around a lot when I was a kid. I was born into a very religious family, a very strict family. I was taught from the very beginning that many, many things were sinful and would lead to death and so on and so forth, and among them was drinking. And we moved around a lot. In the first 8 years of my life, I lived in 6 different towns and cities throughout North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, and 10 different houses, and I think I went to 6 different elementary schools. So everything was a little bit on the go in that early childhood, and I never really felt like I fit in. And I've heard a lot of people say that in AA. And I thought it was just because we moved around so much. As a child growing up, I had examples of good reasons not to drink, besides the fact that I had been told that it was a deadly sin, you know. Some of these reasons included, from all of that childhood of moving around so much, I only have one friend in elementary school that I remember, and her name was Laura Edwards. And she was my best friend in the 3rd grade, and she was killed in an automobile accident. Her mother was driving drunk. You know, and I was told that, and I knew that that was how she died. And, you know, you would think that would make an impression. And then I had an uncle who had a terrible drinking problem and was in and out of prison and various institutions. And then ultimately, later in life, as my own drinking was escalating, He died after being institutionalized for 17 years with alcohol-related dementia. I had a number of cousins who had various substance abuse problems and who died young. One in his 30s, several in their early 50s, and one in his early 60s. And the one in his early 60s, again, it was alcohol-related dementia. So there were lots of good reasons to not drink. But I drank anyway, and my first drink was not at the average, what seems to be the average AA age of something like 11 to 14. It was nothing like that because I went to these Christian schools and would have been expelled from school if I did anything like that. And I was always very much, I kind of did what I was told to do, and I worked hard, and I graduated at the top of my class, and I was the president of the Bible club in high school, and so on and so forth. So drinking was something I really wouldn't think of doing when I was growing up. But somewhere along the way, I decided to change career dreams. Or I feel like I really was kind of called by God and led by God to change career dreams. Before going on to talk about that, I want to say when I came into AA, I heard a lot of people say that they were grateful sober alcoholics, and I didn't think that would ever be me. I didn't think that I would ever be sober. But along the way, I've realized that God has given me everything in my life exactly when I needed it, including my bottom as an alcoholic and Alcoholics Anonymous and so on and so forth. And that's where, looking back, I realized that God called me into doing church music. I had planned to be a physician my entire life, and I was 15 years old, and I heard pipe organ for the first time, and I decided that's what I want to do, and I got to work on it the next day, and a couple of years later, I was off in college studying that, and that's what I did, and that's where my first sip of alcohol happened. It was at the communion rail. I mean, I had grown up in churches where we had always had Welch's grape juice and little oyster crackers. And I had heard that at this church where I would be playing while I was in college for their Wednesday college fellowship, I had heard that they served real wine and that I should stay away from it. My mother had said, if you ever sip that stuff, it's going to burn your throat. And I believed her. And so in this particular church, the organ was in a balcony in the back. And I just stayed up there for communion for the first 6 or 7 weeks. And the priest finally said, why are you not coming down? And I explained, we don't drink, and this will burn my throat. So that's just talking. So that was where I had my first drink. Was at the communion rail. It did not burn. I did not immediately have that feeling of this is wonderful, I want more now, but I thought this is okay, and what I was told was wrong, and it didn't burn, and I didn't turn into dust immediately or anything like that. So at that point, when alcohol was offered to me, I would take it, but it wasn't really that frequently because I was doing a double major in college, and I worked an average of 25 hours a week in college, and there wasn't a lot of time to party, and I stayed kind of near the top of my class in college. I wasn't at the very top. But I would drink occasionally throughout college, and I enjoyed it. But it didn't take off. Alcoholism is a very progressive illness, and for me it was a very slow progression. But once I became an everyday drinker, it was still slow for a while, but eventually it really did take off. A little bit out of order, but I'm discovering that recovery is also progressive, and wherein my alcoholism, every day things got worse. It's exciting that in recovery, as long as I'm practicing principles, every day gets better. So in my 20s, I was not a very regular drinker. Through college, didn't drink that much. I finally started drinking a little bit, I guess around 21 when it was legal. And I eventually figured out in AA exactly when my first alcoholic drinking happened, and it really just happened one night, and then it didn't happen again for quite some time. But I had some friends over for dinner when I got my first apartment on my own, And this one friend of mine who was an Italian opera singer said that she would cook and she needed some red wine for the sauce. And so she made this wonderful sauce, and there was all this red wine left, and I had bought these stemmed wine glasses, and I decided, well, we're all going to drink some red wine because that would be the sophisticated thing to do. And none of us had the palate for it. We had all had like Boone's Farm and that. And so I poured this Merlot, and we had gotten the 1.5-liter bottle, and she only needed a cup for the sauce, maybe. And we poured all this Merlot, and none of my friends could drink it. And I wound up drinking mine and all of theirs, and most, if not all, of the rest of the bottle. And then I wound up kind of checking out on my guests, and I was in my dream, have my own place, entertained, so on and so forth. And here I am, passed out in the bedroom, and I wake up at 4 a.m. and I'm in a mess that's all red, and I have to go buy new linens and stuff that afternoon. Fortunately, that didn't happen again for a while. Actually, that never happened again. Nothing quite that bad as far as those immediate consequences. But looking back, I realized that's the first time I really drank alcoholically. And it still didn't take off, and I think it didn't take off because I was so busy with so many things that I didn't really have the time to do it. But fast forward a few years, I've been at the same church the past 32 years almost, and the first 8.5 years that I worked at that church, I lived about 40 minutes away and had multiple jobs and so on and so forth. But as I got up towards my 30s, the church made me full-time, and I moved over to Raleigh now to be there. And I met all of these wonderful, successful people, most of whom were quite a bit older than me, and they wanted to hang out, and I thought, well, this is great. And they all drank, and most of them were able to drink, and they weren't, one of us. But anyhow, they all drank. They all had these bars in their homes, and they were also hospitable and everything. And I just learned to drink with them, and I just sort of assumed that every day, these people I knew, and normal people, that they all drink every day at the end of the workday. So I started drinking every day, and that began the beginning of about 20 years of everyday drinking. And it still was kind of gradual in the beginning. I mean, it didn't just take off. But as time went by, it became more and more, and there were some really big binges. And I'm really grateful that I didn't suffer any major consequences along the way, although if I had, that might have stopped me earlier. But again, going back to what I said earlier about figuring out in here that God's given me everything I needed exactly when I needed it. God gave me a bottom and gave me sobriety later when I needed it. I was telling Audrey on the way up tonight, many of you heard her speak in December, and you've heard about Audrey's phone pole that she hit with her car, and it's in the neighborhood that I live in. And I was talking about, I didn't drive drunk, I only drove drinking across the neighborhood. But all kinds of bad things can happen driving, drinking across the neighborhood. And I was doing that at the beginning of my 20 years of everyday drinking. I had this friend that I go to her house, and she's a tiny little thing and 30 years older than me. And we were always very proud that we could each drink 7 martinis. And then I'd drive home. And I said I drove past Audrey's phone pole many times during that time. But it was heavy binge drinking, everyday drinking at the beginning of sort of that 20 years, but just no serious consequences. And fortunately, I was highly functional. I was able to go about doing my work, and none of that stuff was influenced. But somewhere along the way, I started really thinking, I've got a problem, and I might need to do something about this. And I had always dealt with a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. And I'm sorry I am not chronological tonight, but going way back to those growing up years and all of this moving around, my parents had worked in 2 different children's homes when I was very, very young. And one of those, they were house parents, and it was a house with 16 boys. And and some very bad things happened there. There was sexual abuse there. It was older kids doing things to younger kids. And anyhow, after that, I started eating a lot. I became a very heavy child. I was huge. And I really, as I started having anxiety and fear in those first few years of the 20 years of everyday drinking, I thought, well, that all goes back to stuff that's happened to me. It doesn't have anything to do with the drinking. It's just anxiety and fear. And I probably drink to calm some of these things that are going on inside my head. And this is normal, and it's not causing a problem. But, as I saw more and more cousins suffer from addiction and alcoholism, really on both sides of the family. The cousins that I mentioned earlier, who were examples of why not to drink, were cousins who were living right in the same county as me, about 20 miles away. But then it turns out there's also alcoholism on my father's side. But as I started to think about, what happened to them could happen to me. Some of them were highly functional. They went to sleep. They didn't wake up. And I thought, that could happen to me. So maybe I better start looking into this. And this is all probably going back 12, 14 years ago. I think I should start looking into this. So at that point, I thought, I will go online periodically, and I will take a test to see if I'm an alcoholic. Because I thought, I'm not an alcoholic. And I had all of these church music friends, and we would go to these conferences, and the bar was always in my room, and I would go to the liquor store the week before the conference, and at that point, I was going from liquor store to liquor store to liquor store to liquor store. I would go to like 4 in Rocky Mount. I'd sometimes go to one in Sharpsburg. I'd go to the one in Nashville. These are little towns near Rocky Mount, because I didn't want them to think I had a problem. So, but when I got ready to go to the big summer conference, I would stock up, and it would be, go get a case and so on and so forth. And we'd load the car up, and off we'd go. And I would tell those friends, I think I might have a problem. They'd say, oh, you're not an alcoholic. You're great at drinking. Keep right on doing it. And I would pass out on them. The bar would be in my room, and they would come in, and we'd all hang out and have these memories of kind of reclining in my bed at 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, and then all of a sudden I wake up at 3 and everyone's gone. The lights are still on, but everyone's left. And so people were telling me who I thought maybe they'll say, yeah, you should do something about it. They said, no, you're fine, you don't need to stop. But I thought, I'll start taking this test. So I started taking the online test for Are You an Alcoholic? And it would say no. And if it was 22 questions, in the beginning, I'd be at like 16. And then when you get to 22, you'd be an alcoholic. And then eventually I was getting more and more and more and more and more, and then I started learning how to lie. Which ones to answer incorrectly. And it's interesting about me lying on questions about alcoholism, because that's eventually what brought me to my bottom, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But I started, lying on these tests and denying that I was an alcoholic, and I'm just great at drinking, and I like to have fun with friends. And at that point, I had friends coming to my house 3 nights a week. It's all about 15 years ago. 3 nights a week, they're coming to my house for drinks. And I wanted them to come to my house for drinks, because that way I could drink as much as I wanted, and I didn't have to drive across the neighborhood or whatever. And then one night a week, after choir rehearsal on Wednesday nights, I would go to somebody else's house for drinks. And then on Friday and Saturday nights, I had these friends who played piano at the bar next door to my church, and I'd go hear them play, and I'd kind of drink light there, but drink more when I got home. But eventually I'm drinking more and more and more and more and more. And so my introduction to AA, again saying that God's given me everything that I've needed precisely when I've needed it. So I met someone, and when Robbie came into my life, I found out that he was an alcoholic. And I found out they have these open meetings, and that I was supposed to go to his anniversary meeting every year. And occasionally, if invited to hear a speaker, I should go hear this particular speaker. One of whom had been my piano student years before and had always come to her lessons drunk. And I was really interested in hearing her when I was told she was speaking and I should come hear her. So I never knew much at all about AA. And even after all those years of going to open meetings with Robbie, I still didn't know much about AA. But I'll get into that a little bit more a little bit later on. But I did start going to these meetings, and the first one was like Robbie's second anniversary, and it's also the group's anniversary in September, and the featured speaker was always Steve. So I got to hear about Bill's Bar and all this kind of stuff, and I thought, this is interesting, good stuff, and we've got a lot in common and so on and so forth, but I still wasn't going to say that I was an alcoholic. This was in 2014. This would have been in September of 2014. Wasn't ready to say that, but was still taking the test online periodically to see what would happen. Meanwhile, my own functionality at work was starting to slip, but people weren't noticing it. But I was noticing it, and I'm sure God was noticing it. But I'm the organist and the director of music, so I get to choose the music. So if you can't play something hard, what do? You choose something a little bit easier. And so that worked out well. I just sort of simplified what I had to do so that I could do it. Because at that point I'm really drinking a great deal. It's accelerating. And I'm not getting not really getting any quality sleep and so on and so forth. But I go to, one or two of these anniversary meetings, and then finally, probably around about 2015, I go to take the Are You an Alcoholic test again. And immediately an article comes up for a scholarly thing that was in the Atlantic Journal, and it was about a miracle drug that could turn me into a normal drinker. And so, alcoholism is a very emotional illness, and so I just jumped onto that, and I read everything I could read about it, and I watched the documentary, and I cried, and I thought, it's not my fault, and, I can become a normal drinker. And so it was about time for my annual physical. So I went to my physician, who's also a very dear friend of mine, and who was giving me wine occasionally and a bottle of Maker's Mark every Christmas and so on and so forth. But I went to her for my annual physical, and she'd always ask how many drinks I had each day. She knew I drank a lot, but she knew I was still functioning. And I usually told her 4 or 5. She's like, you need to cut that back to 2. But but I went to her and I decided, well, I'm going to be honest, because I want to get on this miracle drug. And at this point, I probably was up to 10 drinks a day, more than likely, by 2015. And so it's progressing along at this point. And so she said, well, I've never heard of that drug. And she went back and she did some research and everything. And she said, I'll have to send you to a psychiatrist if you want. So I said, a psychiatrist? And so I was honest with her at that point about, and I'd never had any kind of therapy in my life, and I'd never been on any medications and so on and so forth. And I really, although I had a great deal of anxiety and fear, which accelerates over the next few years that I'm about to get into, had a great deal of that, and I'd had some bad things that had happened in my past and so on and so forth. I thought that I had taken control of everything, and that I was able to just live life well, even though things had happened, but I obviously could not. I mean, the only way that I was getting through life was by retiring into alcohol every night, near the end, even more than at night. So anyhow, I thought a psychiatrist, and she said, well, it's the only way you're going to get this drug. So she mentioned some addiction specialist up here in the Triangle that Audrey just mentioned tonight on the drive, and I was able to get into someone else quicker, closer to home, and so I went to that person, and she said, yeah, I can give you this drug. And she said, we've got to do blood work first. I said, I brought my labs, and I had brought my printout of my lab work for my physical. And she looked at it all, and she said, yes, we can. She said, I can give you a shot of this today. today in your bottle. And she said, the shot will work the best. And so she gives me the shot, and I go off, and I'm like, this is it. This is my solution. I will be a normal drinker. Everything's fine. And so I go off, and I had 2 glasses of wine a day for a month. I think that was all psychosomatic. I really did, but I thought, that's it. I'm a normal drinker. I'm cured. And she said I'd have to see the therapist in order for her to do this. So she hooked me up with a therapist, and that was great because I got to go in and talk about how horrible my life was. And I got to wallow in self-pity, and everything is everybody else's fault. And, you know, he said, well, you obviously suffer from general anxiety disorder, and he puts me in a book. It's called Treatments That Work, and it's called Mastering Your Own Fear and Anxiety. So we were off to try to master my fear and anxiety through these various exercises and so on and so forth. And he said that from childhood trauma, my amygdala was damaged, and that we had to recondition my amygdala. So I never heard of the amygdala, but I thought, well, that's really cool. We're going to recondition this amygdala. And a few years before, believe it or not, I had been a gym rat for a brief period of time and had run a half marathon and all this kind of stuff. So I thought, well, I conditioned my body. It's my time. Now we will condition the amygdala. So we set off to do that. And it didn't work. I mean, I was wallowed in self-pity all the time. So I wasted 2 or 3 years of his time. And after the initial shot of the miracle drug, which I don't recommend, I decided no more of those because I've always been very afraid of everything I was. And so I would always go online and read everything that a drug could possibly do. And when I read some of the things that that drug could do to me, I thought, no, I don't want to be on that. So I went back into the psychiatrist and said, let's switch to the pill form. So we went back in and we switched to the pill form. She said, it's not going to work for you. She said, you're too serious an alcoholic for this pill to work for you. She said, the only thing that will work for you is the shot. I said, well, I don't want the shot. She said, I don't like giving the shot to people. She said, but I have to give it to alcoholics. And she said, I have to give shots to some of my psychotic patients. I said, psychotic? She's labeling me right here with them. But at this point, the drinking is really accelerated. And at this point, you know, getting into the therapy and everything, I mean, all I did was drink more after that 1 month of 2 glasses a day. It was just more. And at this point, I'm to where whatever time I finished work, which for me occasionally would be as early as 6:30, but more often at that time in my life, it was somewhere between 7 and 10 p.m., I'd start drinking bourbon. You know, whatever time I got home in the first hour, I'd have 5 or 6 drinks. And then I would sort of pass out or brown out or whatever. I'd wake up a couple of hours later, do it again, and I might do it 2 or 3 times before bed. And then near the end, I'd wake up at 4 or 4:30 in the morning and would have 2 or 3 more drinks so that I could sleep until like 8:30. And then I decided a little wine with lunch would be a nice thing. So before you know it, I'm having a bottle of Chardonnay every day at lunch. So at the end, I'm easily like a 15 drink a day drinker. And that's probably for like the last couple of years. And still no major consequences, which is just, you know, remarkable. And I'm grateful to God that there never were major consequences. But at the same time that all of that's going on, the anxiety and the fear is accelerating, even though, you know, we did the workbook, sort of, and I should have mastered my fear because, you know, I'm a self-sufficient person and I can take care of all of my problems. And even though I'm in the church, I didn't really pray at that point. My only real regular prayer was on Sunday morning, and it was Sunday morning in the shower, and it was usually, dear God, get me through this morning at church, and I won't drink again for quite some time. And that quite some time was usually lunchtime. And lunchtime. I was never going to promise God I wouldn't drink for a day, because I knew I could not go that long. And so See, I was not praying. I was not willing to turn anything over to God's care. This therapist that I was seeing, when I Googled him to find out more about him, I found out that he was also a preacher at a country church, and he never talked to me about that. He just talked to me about various exercises that I could do to learn how to control my own anxiety and fear. And once I got the anxiety and fear and the amygdala under control, then I would stop drinking. And I really did believe that was what would happen. Once those things were under control, I would stop drinking. But then, as time goes by, I eventually, what led me into AA for myself, and at this point I had been to probably 6 of those anniversary meetings, maybe 5 of those anniversaries. I've been to quite a few of the anniversary meetings, and I've been to a number of other open meetings, but still didn't really know what AA was all about. I just thought they get together and they hang out and they pat each other on the back and they don't drink together, and that's what I thought it was all about. Well, at this point, I had bought a little house, and the insurance salesman tried to talk me into a life insurance policy. I didn't think I really needed it, but I decided, well, he said it'd be $30 a month, and I thought, well, I'll go ahead and do this. You know, I'm 50 years old at this point, and I thought it's worth going ahead and getting this just in case. And so I'm an only child, and I thought this will help my mom if anything happens to me in an untimely fashion. And so I said, sure, I'll do that. Well, he starts asking me basic questions, and my health was generally good. I still went to my physician every year for the checkup and blood work and all that kind of stuff. But he starts asking me questions, and one of them is, how much do you drink? And I said, well, it's, 4 or 5 drinks a day. Well, I thought that was not much. And I had no idea that would trigger them to do a blood test to see how much you drink. But it did, and he had initially told me that the physical would be height, weight, blood pressure. Well, the lady comes in and she draws blood, and I had the usual 15 drinks the day before. And I had eaten fatty foods and salty foods that morning and so on and so forth, and because I didn't know she was going to do all this kind of stuff to me. And so she does this blood work, and she didn't tell me what they were drawing blood for. But a week later, I get this big packet from the insurance company, and it says, according to your blood work, you have 8 to 10 drinks per day. Well, it really was not accurate, because I was really having closer to 15. Anyhow, according to your blood work, you have 8 to 10 drinks per day. And this is very, very dangerous. And if you continue living like this, and they also said that some other things were off, and it turns out those were all false positives, thanks be to God. They said you might have cancer, so on and so forth, this, that, and the other. It's December 12th when this package arrives in the mail. They said, if you don't do something about this, you could die young, and we will not insure you. And that was what it took for me. I read that, and in that moment, I thought, well, I don't care if I die young. I really love drinking. But I'm an only child, and I had a very old cat that was a very mean one-person cat. And I thought, I don't want to die before my mother or my cat. So I rolled. And so this was Wednesday night. So the next night I was in Wilson, a primary purpose, every Thursday night, open speaker meeting, and telling everyone that I was there for me. And a lot of people didn't believe I was an alcoholic. They're like, are you sure? Robbie didn't even think I was an alcoholic. He said, go ahead and work the program if you want to. I think you'll find out you're not an alcoholic. Well, I was an alcoholic, and I was a very spiritually deficient alcoholic. I had no idea that AA was a spiritual program. It took me a little while, inside the rooms even, to figure out that AA was a spiritual program. I thought alcoholism was a disease of body and mind, and I thought I'd address this. I've seen the doctor, I've seen the psychiatrist, I've tried the drugs, I've gone to the therapist, I've worked on my mind, I've done all of these things. I did not realize that alcoholism is a disease of body, mind, and spirit. And I did not realize that I had this huge hole within me that could only be filled by developing this relationship with God that had really become very, very tattered through my years of self-sufficiency, self-pity, and alcoholism. And so, I came in December 12th. I thought, I'm not trying to quit quickly. And because it's Advent Christmas season, and I'm really, really busy with church, and I'm going to taper off. And so that was my plan. And that night that package arrived from the insurance company, I poured myself a drink immediately. But I took myself an hour and a half to drink that first drink. And then I had like 5 more. And that was that. But I did manage from December 12th to December 27th to have my last drink of bourbon on the 27th of December. But I thought I will switch to wine at this point. That won't be as bad. And so at this point, I'm going to at least one AA meeting a week. I would have quickly joined this Wilson group, but I have a musical commitment on Monday nights, and they meet on Mondays and Thursdays. So I thought I'll go to their Thursday speaker meetings, and I thought right after Christmas I'll start going to a closed meeting of another group. And so at this point I'm just drinking wine. I go to this closed meeting with this other group. A friend of mine who had been my piano student years earlier asked me what my sobriety date is. I say, it's forthcoming. Because I saw her recently for the first time, and I don't know when. And I said, by the way, my sobriety date is now almost 4 years ago, and I said, thank you for being patient with me. But I'm so grateful for our third tradition. The only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. But that's my favorite tradition. I realized during a tradition meeting about a year ago maybe that I really, when I came in, did not have a desire to stop drinking. I was motivated by fear. I had fear of what would happen if I didn't stop drinking. But I stayed long enough that it turned into a desire to stop drinking. And I'm very, very, very grateful for that. And, I feel like God spoke to me through various people along the way. Near the end of the bourbon drinking, where I was going in and getting a half a gallon every 2 days, 3 days at the most, it would last. I was going to all these different liquor stores, and I had moved out of this one neighborhood 6 years prior, and then I moved back into the neighborhood, and started going to a liquor store I hadn't been to in 6 years. And the same gentleman worked there who worked there before. A wonderful old man, reminded me of Morgan Freeman. And he's checking me out one day with my half gallon, and he says to me in this wonderful voice, "You've been drinking this stuff for a long time." And I said, "Yes, I have." And there were a number of other messages. This little house that I bought, turns out this lady who's connected through various people to some family of mine had lived in this house for like 20 years, and she had died in the house about a year before I bought it. And she had left all of these faith over fear messages on the insides of the cabinet doors. And at first I thought, well, those are silly, I'm going to take them down. And then I thought, well, I don't know that I can take them down. She died in this house. Who knows what might happen if I take them down? So I left them up. And eventually I gradually started taking some of them down, but I've left some of them up. And I still see some of them. So I felt like that was God speaking to me. And God spoke to me in many ways on my way in, but then I got in, and God spoke to me through the people in the rooms, and I did not realize that at first. But Paige wound up saying meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, that if you just wake up each morning and pray, that God would keep you sober that day. And then pray as needed through the day if you're thinking about drinking. And then at night, thank God for sobriety that day. That would take care of the problem. So I come to all of these meetings still drinking from December through March and early March. And finally, Ash Wednesday was coming up, and I thought this is a good time to maybe try this, because I had told a priest I had worked with before that I was thinking about giving up drinking for Lent one year, and he said, "Oh, don't do that." And I think he thought that my functionality would go down if I stopped drinking. So, and near the end here, my anxiety and fear levels were so high that I almost walked out of like very large funerals with 400 or 500 people in attendance because I didn't think I could play the next piece. Very simple pieces, but I was really just coming into this very anxious and very, very fearful place. Well, on Ash Wednesday, March 6th of 2019, I finally prayed that morning. And that first day was not necessarily easy, but with God's help I made it through, and that night I thanked God for it. And that Christmas, I'd asked Robbie for us not to do gifts that year, but he gave me this book, and he also gave me the Daily Reflections. And this is the best Christmas present I've ever received. And so I did not immediately start reading this. I had heard that you were supposed to read the first 164 pages, and I went online and I read them in about 3 hours, and I thought, well, I've done that, check that off. And so but I started reading Daily Reflections each day, started reading from Living Sober, which Audrey recommended, and started praying each day. And they're simple prayers. I just do that simple prayer that he taught me each morning of, do more than that now. But my prayers are simple. I learned along the way that I needed to pray for others, and I started praying for others, and I have kind of a list of categories, and various people fall into these different categories, and pray for people in the world, in the community, in my church, in my AA group, in my family, and so on and so forth. And sometimes when I pray for others long enough, I get to a point that by the time I get to the end, I say my prayers for me for the very end. I'm like, I don't really have anything other than gratitude. I need to just be thankful that I'm alive, and that God has relieved me of the suffering from alcoholism. So yeah, I started praying, and for me, that's what worked. And then I did not immediately get a sponsor. I was afraid of rejection, and I thought, I'll ask someone to be my sponsor, they'll say no. So I made a list of 6 people. The first person I asked said yes. And so that was about 6 months after getting in. And then I kind of dragged my feet on the steps, and we got through step 7 just before COVID hit. And in the first few steps, I'm not sure that in my heart and my mind I thought I knew everything, but I did what I was told to do. But when I got to step 7, we were under the picnic shelter outside of the church where we meet that day, and I really felt something. And I've participated in lots of ordination services through the years and consecrations of bishops and so on and so forth. And I felt something in that simple prayer under that picnic table that I've never felt in any other place or time. And it was something wonderful. And then COVID hit and started dragging my feet some more. And anyhow, we are now working on step 10. And last Friday, we spent like an hour and a half on a page. And I thought, this is such incredible stuff in here that you can spend an hour and a half on a page. But there's so much, and I thought, I've got a lot of markings in my book, but then I look at Paige's book, and I'm like, I don't have any markings in my book. And so this book is just full of so much amazing stuff, and it's been wonderful to walk this journey and to be led through this book and to continue to be led through this book. And you know, when I came in, the church I was raised in was very, 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 very strict. And the prayers were very much, they were created in the moment. The church that I've worked in for very many years, the prayers are very formal. They're all written down and we read them and so on and so forth. But it's through, and they're beautiful, and there's a lot of great stuff there that I hear now in ways that I never heard before I came in here and started working on spiritual progress day by day. But prayer is just so essential, along with working steps, and it's part of the steps throughout the steps. And my mom has a little sampler in her house that says, life outlined by prayer is less likely to come unraveled. And it used to be that I kind of looked at that and thought, well, isn't that sweet? Who will I give that to? It will go somewhere in my home and will mean a great deal to me. So I want to just finish by reading one of my favorite lines, and it's at the end of the doctor's opinion. And the fact that I had thought this was a disease of body and mind, and I had sought help in those ways, but I only found the help here by joining the spiritual journey that we are all on. I love what Dr. Silkworth says at the end, where he says, I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through, and though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. And I hope I remain to pray for a long time, and that it continues to work. So thank you.